This is Cameron Collins of Unincarcerated Productions, and you're listening to Justice Delayed.
You decide what you want to be when you grow up.
Today we are joined by a very special criminal justice expert, Wolf Sittler. A 1968 University of Minnesota graduate with a master's in social work, Wolf spent the next 20 years dealing with a wide range of social and criminal justice issues, ranging from probation and parole to family counseling. In 2016, Wolf was instrumental in having a 65-page report published by the Marshall Project titled The Responsible Prison Project. This report, written by 5 Texas inmates, describes how prison conditions could be improved. Wolf has facilitated the release of one of Texas inmates who spent 24 years in the state's prison system as a result of a wrongful conviction. His criminal justice efforts have produced media investigations about a Texas decade-old House Criminal Justice Oversight Committee that criminal justice advocates like Wolf insist should be funded to investigate Texas prison conditions. Wolf is currently working on a report that will be presented this July to Texas lawmakers. Here's Billy and Jodie with that interview.
Do you want the truth about criminal justice? Get it right here, right now from Wolf Sittler. He's a former probation parole officer with a degree in social work who is up in arms over 8 suicides in Texas prisons in 2 months in 2021, and the desperate need for prison reform in the Lone Star State and across the U.S. This is a quote from his website, teensinprison.org. I am on a mission to work with others to transform the criminal justice system. The long-range vision is to promote fairness and real justice to a system that sorely lacks it, irrespective of age, color, or financial well-being. The problems are massive, so the solutions need to be comprehensive.
The U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics between 2001 and 2016 reports that 6% of all state and federal inmate deaths are the result of suicide. 17 inmate suicide deaths per 100,000 are male, while 13 of those suicide deaths are female. The LBJ Journal of Public Affairs informs that jail suicides nationwide occurred at a rate 3 times higher than prison suicides. Wolf is here today to share his ideas about solving this crisis. Wolf has written, Obstacles to Change are based on Wolf's experience. He says what others look on as a subgroup must be looked on as equals. Punishment is the deprivation of freedom. Living inside a correction facility is supposed to be about correcting. If neither suggests nor authorizes blindness to the golden rule.
Talk about prison and jail suicides points directly to the underlying cause of both of these horrendous tragedies, and that is the lack of health care in U.S. prisons and jails. It's well documented in articles that date all the way back to 2015, for example, in the incredible number of stories about that on the Marshall Project website. And that subject has been covered in depth by the Associated Press, the Washington Post, USA Today, and other major news outlets, as well as nonprofits like the Prison Policy Initiative. The stories they tell about prisoners who committed suicide with homemade knives and nooses or suffered from the lack of medical care are heartbreaking.
With this preliminary message, information out of the way, Wolf, and thanks, by the way, thank you for coming and thank you for being here. We're glad to get your expert opinion and your advice on how to deal with this crisis. In particular, speaking to those 8 suicides that occurred in Texas alone over just a 2-month period, what impact do you think those suicides have had on the Lone Star State's prison and jail system?
Thanks for having me. I don't know how much of an expert I am, but I have a long-term interest in the justice system in our country. And those 8 suicides, I figure they probably will not impact the administration of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. They impact mostly people like me, or they impact family members, they impact other prisoners. But from what I can tell, the current administration that goes all the way up to the governor basically is tone deaf to the concerns of prisoners and their families, and that would include staff members, since staff members have to put up with a lot of the conditions inside of prisons. And those 8 suicides are the most dramatic example of the dysfunction that is allowed to continue inside of prisons. Certainly, most of those individuals who took that drastic step as a response to unlivable conditions inside of the prisons probably had there's a lead up to that. You don't just decide overnight to take your life. You have to have as a rule, an environment that is, not conducive to personal health, emotional health, psychological health, spiritual health, and little hope for your future. And the way the system is set up in Texas, there are few avenues of hope that prisoners have because of, for example, mandatory minimums that mean that no matter how well you do in prison, it makes no difference in terms of your eligibility for release. That's predetermined in advance by some folks who somehow think they have a crystal ball and can know, what's a good length of time for a person to be incarcerated.
Well, when you're speaking about Texas, I do have a heartbreaking Facebook post from a mother who lost her son on July 24, 2021 in Texas. And she says in this post, quote, which she put up on July 25 because she got the information the next day, quote, add my son to the list of those majorly impacted by the Texas prison system. He hung himself yesterday. Vitals are good, but very little brain activity. At least he will die in air conditioning. I'm shattered and very pissed off. Heads will freaking roll. I realize in hindsight that this puts fear in your heart for your loved one. Please know that our son has extreme mental illness due to abuse in the orphanage we adopted him from, including traumatic brain injury. He's tried multiple times in the past. The prison system was just the straw that broke him. And that is what that mother posted on July 25, which I saw on my Facebook page. She is a member of Texas Prisons Community Advocates. And I see emails all the time from Texas families about their loved ones in prison and the difficulties they're having. This one, of course, was about the suicide of her son, which I think probably might have been prevented, Wolf, and I'll see what you think about that, might have been prevented if Texas prison system and jail system had adequate health care.
Well, I agree that the operative word, of course, is might, but if he's like a lot of other prisoners in Texas prisons, he did not have access to adequate psychological, psychiatric help. The system is not funded to provide that kind of help at the scale that it is needed. And it's been pretty clear for some time that our prisons, not just in Texas, are the biggest mental health facilities in each state where they exist. And if you have so many people with mental and emotional issues in prisons and inadequate staff or commitment to deal with those issues, this is kind of a natural consequence. It's the most dramatic consequence and the most tragic.
It definitely is that. And I'm looking at an article posted by Prison Policy Initiative. And it's pretty shocking. It was published June 8, 2021. And it says the latest data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics on mortality in state and federal prisons is a reminder that prisons are, in fact, quote, death-making institutions, in quotes, and that it is very difficult that, like the deaths that she is talking about here, this author, suicide, homicide, and drug and alcohol intoxication. But it's very interesting to me that suicide is the first thing listed here.
Let me interject one point here, Wolf. In the prison system, and I have a lot of experience in dealing with the prison system, mental health comes under the umbrella of the overall healthcare delivery system, which is called a medical system. There's the medical side, and then there's the mental side. When you start having physical problems in a state penal facility, the first cuts are made to social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists. It's mental health that gets the cut. They are, in terms of physical priority, they are the low man on the totem pole.
Mhm.
Security and healthcare are ranked first and second. Now, with these 8 people, these 8 inmates that committed suicide over the last few months, what I believe is happening there is that during the pandemic, and even now with the occasion of the Delta variant, the free world healthcare delivery system are so stressed, so inundated with virus-related problems that prisons have no place of sending the inmates to outside facilities for medical or mental health care. Usually, if a prisoner has a real serious mental health issue that is identified within the system, they will transfer him to a facility outside the prison facility for some kind of treatment and care. That's not available today. So what I'm trying to determine here is that beginning in 2015, the TDCJ reports with its own statistics that the suicide rate has increased in Texas. Do you think these 8 are definitely related to the virus, or are they part of that pattern of increase that's been taking place since 2015?
Well, I think, all those things that you mentioned certainly impact a person that's living inside of prison. But I think more than that is the lack of available services for incarcerated people. That's nothing new. There's never been a comprehensive focus on attending to the identified needs of people in prison. And that's, even though that's the mission, for example, of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, states one of their primary missions is to promote positive change in offender behavior. And in order to do that, well, you have to provide the services that people need in order to change their behavior. And certainly the pandemic siphoned off medical care or shifted the focus to prevention of the spread of the virus. And maybe guys like were mentioned earlier, they just kind of fell off the radar. But still, my background in social work informs me that medication, however properly dispensed, is not an end-all solution for mental issues. And there has to be some room for conversation and personal relationships, and that is not available, as far as I know, in Texas prisons anyway. There's no room in the budget. There's no room in the vision of the law enforcement folks that run these institutions. They're not human service professionals. Their focus is on making sure nobody escapes, making sure nobody breaks the rules, and stuff like that. And
you think that is because, particularly in private prisons where profit is the singular motive, do you think it's because medication is cheaper than counseling, that it's easier for the prison to provide medication than it is to have professionals providing counseling?
No, you're exactly right. In the last, the last number of decades, the shift in psychiatry has moved from actual talk therapy to medication therapy, in the belief that, well, that will, just give them a pill and that'll solve the problem. And that obviously does not work. And just those 8 individuals that were mentioned, there are probably quite a few more who the department did not want to list as suicides because it makes them look bad. So again, it's a reflection of the vision of the administrators, the vision of higher up elected officials like the governor, to actually promote a system inside the walls that is consistent with the vision that they have stated. I see no evidence that that is about to happen. I see all kinds of evidence that they have no interest in that. And they claim that, well, that's being soft on crime or something if you treat individuals like human beings. It's I don't know, it's a reflection of a real conservative type of view of people in trouble with the law. It's somehow, like I mentioned, or like you mentioned earlier, that they're considered to be, less than, even though just about everybody I know has broken the law in one way or another. But that doesn't change anything in terms of how healthcare is provided inside these publicly funded institutions.
Well, there is another article on the Jesuit Review, which is called America. And it is definitely says what Billy was saying is that security eclipses health and well-being. But it also, another article talks about a majority of states, and probably including Texas, and I will admit I've not researched that, a majority of states have contracted out prison health care to private companies. And of course, the basis there is profit. And the inmates that routinely have to complain of the same symptoms multiple times before they even get to see a doctor. And now a lot of the profit has gone out of this business model. And this article in Governing, which is another very good website, says that this business model of, okay, private company, you take care of the healthcare inside my prisons, it was a growth area, and now it's stagnant. So that being the case, you can see that obviously, even though the Supreme Court at one time, and Billy has a history on this, because I don't, since he has the paralegal background, and that is the US Supreme Court decision that said that inmates, some years ago, it said that inmates are entitled to the same health care that is available to people on the outside.
The decision was in the 1970s. It was Estelle versus Gamble. And Gamble recognized that inmate does have a right to medical care. That over the last 30, 35, 40 years, the Supreme Court in a number of cases has reduced that quote unquote right to where it is virtually impossible now to go into a federal court and establish a medical deprivation claim because the burden is so high. You have to show now not only that there was a deliberate indifference to your healthcare needs, you must show that the individual responsible for that deliberate indifference did so with a specific intent to cause you harm. And that's a burden that's almost impossible to overcome. So you have a situation now where healthcare comes on a hit and miss basis. You go to the infirmary, you go and see what they can provide. And if they cannot provide a specific treatment, they transfer you to a facility in the free world, as I said a while ago. But right now, those facilities are packed. There's nowhere, no place to transfer inmates out of the system for either medical care or mental health care.
Well, that business model we were just discussing, in light of the fact that, it creates an incentive to cut costs. Okay, well, we can cut this cost easier. It's because the security is going to cost us this much, and we can't cut that down, but we sure can cut down costs when it comes to healthcare, which we're contracting out to these private places. It's, to me, and there are so many examples in all the cases that I looked up of people, really suffering. And I read about a guy in Michigan who lost all of his teeth because the outside dentist said, well, they're decayed, pull them out. And he cannot get any dentures. And they say, well, if you don't have dentures, that's not a medical emergency. Even though his gums are swollen up and they're bleeding and it's very hard for him to eat. Well, it's not a medical emergency. We're just, serve you soft food. And then there are plenty of others in all these articles about prison suicides, Wolf, where Billy was just referring to in terms of the court cases, where you cannot blame a guard had to have an incentive to kill you. And yet in so many of these stories that I looked at, it was negligence. It wasn't intentional to kill somebody. It was just flat negligence. Like they said in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, well, the guards that were supposed to be watching him every 30 minutes were really tired because they served an extra shift. And so their backs were turned. And so they really didn't have any idea what was happening. And that's because we were understaffed and they were tired.
Yeah, so that would mean that trying to file lawsuits to address these, gaps in the system is almost impossible. That's what you're saying, right, Billy?
Yeah, because if you look at the legal research, and no matter what federal circuit it's in, the overwhelming majority, I mean, if I use the term 99 out of 100, which would probably be a safe guess, 99 out of 100 medical and mental health deprivation claims resolved in favor of the prison system and not the inmate.
Right. Yeah. And all this goes back to how prisoners are viewed. If prisoners are viewed like, according to the 13th Amendment, like they are slaves, well, you just do not treat your slaves like you treat your neighbor. And so that creates a lack of concern for the well-being of anyone that's in prison that is unfortunately quite constitutional.
Well, one point I want to make here, Wolf, when you talk about the way inmates are treated, Jodie raised the question of the issue about Jeffrey Epstein. That was a pre-pandemic suicide.
Yeah.
Since the pandemic, prison guards are actually abandoning their posts. They're quitting in droves. And these states that have been hard hit by the Delta variant are having to increase their salaries just to attract new guards. And most of them are dramatically understaffed. Most of these prison systems in Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, all these deep South Southern states are dramatically understaffed right now. So if an inmate refuses vaccination, they put him in a lockdown tier. Well, they don't have guards to monitor those lockdown tiers. They may have one prison guard over a 12-hour shift, make one round to just be sure the bar's all intact, nobody's escaped, but they're not there to check on them to make sure that they are psychologically okay or if they're having no mental health. They could care less about. All they want to do is make sure that he's properly secured in that cell when they pass down the tier. And so with this shortage of guard staff, you're going to have more people commit suicide and more people harming themselves, not just with suicide, but in self-mutilation and a whole lot of other ways.
There's a story that, before we get to what you think, which we need to discuss, or what can we do about this? People at this point probably listening to this are now thinking what we can do about this to stop it. But just before we do, there's one case that illustrates what you were saying, Wolf, and what Billy was saying is. And this took place in a Chicago jail. And this is a 26-year-old Marine who committed suicide. And the video showed that he emptied out an unlocked utility closet, stood there for a moment looking at a surveillance camera before stepping inside and closing the closet door. About an hour later, a guard appears and finds that he has committed suicide. Now, he had 6 weeks before he did that, he had gotten drunk and attempted suicide. He'd already done that once. But he suffered from depression and anxiety. He had post-traumatic stress disorder after serving with the Marines for almost 8 years, including deployments to Afghanistan and Japan. Japan on a mission to collect human remains after the 2011 tsunami. But here's an inmate who obviously has a history of this, and the guards just weren't paying any attention to him. So he could stand there, open a closet door, take out all this stuff, stand there, look at the surveillance camera, step inside, close the door, and kill himself. And that's not the only example in this whole list of inmates committing suicide, like the one in Pennsylvania that was left unsupervised long enough to construct a noose out of materials in his cell, where he hanged himself from his bunk.
So where do we go from here, Wolf?
Right.
Well,
That's a load for you to talk about, but I know
Yeah.
that you may, and it's difficult, but I know that given your experience, you probably know we should be advocating for and how we should do it.
well, that's going to take a major transformation in attitude and belief and philosophy on the part of people who operate prisons. Like the guards you're talking about, who they're, first of all, like in Texas, there's a huge guard shortage. There has been for years. There's 5,700 empty guard positions. And the thing about a guard, well, a prison, someone who work, a correctional officer is more than a guard, except in our country where all they do is they watch the prisoners, make sure they follow the rules and stuff like that. They're not tasked with helping inmates. They're not tasked with identifying problems that people have and making sure they get the services that they need. They're not tasked with that because the people above them, which goes all the way up to the governor, do not have that as a priority. And until that becomes a priority, really helping people like it states in the mission statement, or correcting, helping people correct themselves, until we get to that point, what's going to change? If the whole focus so far has always been on security in prisons, and the count is the main thing that the guards do besides writing up prisoners for infractions that don't make any sense as a rule. It's not about helping the people that are inside, even though that's supposed to be their mission. So you can't really blame it on the guards since they're following the direction of their.
Yeah, that's like you said, that's the security priority they've been trained to deal with. The larger question is are there advocacy groups? Are there ideas? Are there ways of trying to change the conservative political mindset that once locked away, like you say, you're no longer human, so you're no longer worthy of treatment. We're not going to beat you. We're not going to gas you. We're not going to do this unless there's a threat, unless you pose a physical threat. Otherwise, all we want you to do is just what you said, obey the rules, and we don't care what your mental health or your medical needs really are. And that's the prevailing attitude in prison. Are there ways that this can be changed within the physical constraints that every state is under right now?
Well, let me ask you this question, Wolf. It's the one thing that sort of gives me hope, and that is, and my mother would wash my mouth out with soap for me putting it this way, but money talks and BS walks. Now, the cost of incarceration is rising and has been for years with the increase in the number of prisoners and the cost of keeping those people behind bars. So my hope is, and I want to know what you think about this, is as those costs continue to rise, will that attract taxpayer attention enough that we try to find a way like they do in some European prisons where the recidivism rate is much lower than it is here, where you educate inmates, where you try to get them past their mental health issues or their health issues, but you take care of them as human beings. Do you think the cost of imprisoning these people as it rises will have any effect on stopping this?
I doubt it, unless the cost goes beyond the dollar cost. For example, when people are released from prison and they're not prepared for life in this world, a fair number of them get back in trouble. They create more victims. Well, take the example of California, where the cost of keeping a person in prison is about the same as attending Harvard. The people in California are not jumping up and down saying we need to change this, because they're stuck in the same mindset as a lot of other people, that prisoners are not the same as the rest of us. Therefore, we don't have to treat them like we'd like to be treated. But the actual cost, again, the financial cost, people don't really seem to care about the money when it comes to prisons. Like in Texas, it costs $3.5 billion every year to operate the prison system. No one talks about, is there a way that we can get a better return on our investment? If this prisons were a private business, they would be subject to audits to determine, is the money being spent getting the return that is necessary for a profit-making business? You know, if a profit-making business had 20 to 70% of their products returned as defective, they would not be in business. So
That's the recidivism rate, the defective product. You were mentioning the recidivism rate before as potentially a factor in making the public aware that you can take care of this problem, you should take care of this problem.
Well, you know, prisons right now, every sheriff that operates a large county jail facility like LA, New York, Orleans, Chicago, Philadelphia, every one of these sheriffs in these counties will tell you that they have become mental health centers.
Yeah.
That people in the free world with mental health issues and mental health problems are placed in jail for mostly minor petty offenses, and they cannot afford to make bail, and they enter the system with all these psychological problems, and the jail system simply is not equipped and cannot afford to equip the need to take care of these mental health issues. So taxpayers will fund incarceration, but they will not fund change. They will not fund programs that offer the inmate the incentive to change or the need to change. For example, there's no alternative mental health programs to any measurable degree that these inmates, mental health people being packed in jails can be referred to in the free community. Jail is the most convenient and readily available place for them to be removed from the street where they may pose minor threats or major threats.
Yep.
Go ahead, Wolf. Go ahead.
That's true. But if the actual long-term costs of not taking care of these issues were made known, and I think people would start thinking, well, maybe we need to provide some of these services earlier on, because if you look at the long-term costs, they're definitely they're not sustainable. They're harmful. But all the emphasis in our country pretty much is on short-term everything. What can we get out of something now, as opposed to what is the effect of this kind of lack of attention 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? How are we actually, what are we paying for all this?
Well, if we took, you mentioned a while ago that Texas budgets around $3.5 billion for its prison system.
Mm-hmm.
Probably 35 to 40% of the Texas prison inmates could be housed in community-based facilities or be released under their own, minimum supervision. They're nonviolent offenders. They pose no threat to anyone in society. Never have. They've committed basically minor property crimes, and they get sent to prison. They get out, and they go back out, and they steal another pizza, and they wind back up in prison on under some kind of repeat offender statute, where they get a large amount of time. If the state of Texas were to take and remove the non-dangerous, the non-violent inmates out of its system, that would save them probably half of that $3 billion, which could then be redirected to the serious mental health and medical care and security supervision needs that the remaining inmates would need. The remaining 60% of the inmates would need. You would have a much better prison system. But how do you convince the taxpayers of this state that 40% of its prison population should be released?
I just noticed in Texas, I think it's in Texas, for example, that maybe it's on the national level, all of the people who were released from prison, but still under federal supervision to avoid getting the virus, are now being sent back to prison. And my question about that is, if they did just fine outside between, say, March 2020 to March 2021, and there were no more in breaking the law, no more crimes, no more nothing, Why are these people being sent back?
Well, that's a very good question, and the people who support that say, well, that's what the rules say. Although, the president, in the case of federal prisoners, has the authority to override that transition back to prison for those 4,000 people. He could say, I'm going to grant clemency to everybody that has shown that they can handle life outside of prison. And that would take care of that 4,000, but that doesn't address the needs of that 30 or 40% you were talking about, Billy, that could do just as well outside of prison and do not require incarceration. And an additional factor there is a lot of people seem to think that, well, if someone's convicted of a violent crime, therefore they are violent and they should not have the same possibilities for clemency or release as those with nonviolent crimes. And that is not true. There are plenty of people convicted of violent crimes who are not actually violent, not more than any of us who, in the right conditions could do something violent. So
Well, I agree that there should be vehicles for release for all offenders. I mean, the vehicle for release doesn't mean that the release will actually take place, but there should be people, like you say, who have spent 20, 30, 40 years in prison for a violent offense, who have completely shown that they are no longer a threat to society and that they can be safely released back into the community. There are thousands of those kinds of cases. And I agree with you, there should be vehicles for release, whether it's parole, whether it's commutation of sentence, whether it's just what they call the old timers law, where after you reach a certain age and served a certain amount of time on a given offense, that you be eligible for release, But while they're locked up, while all these inmates are locked up during that 10, 20, 30, 40 year that they're locked up, if we release the nonviolent offenders, then more can be done to help those other quote unquote violent offenders become nonviolent through a whole assortment of rehabilitative programs. The first being having an improved and a responsible mental health care program within the prison system.
Well, we all need to work on that, and we're with you, Wolf. Anything that we can do to further that, please don't hesitate at all to get in touch with us and say, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to publicize this more. How can we publicize this more? What can we do? Because we'll do everything we can to help you reach your goals that you state on your website, which, as we're saying goodbye, tell us a bit about that website and the name of it, and people can go to it and what they can learn.
Okay, well, when I started that website, I was involved with a guy who'd been sent to prison at age 17 with a 50-year sentence for something that turns out he didn't do. He did commit a crime, but my focus then was on juveniles sent to adult prisons. So I named this website teensinprison.org because the focus, I thought, well, maybe people would have more compassion towards, kids that get into trouble and that get extremely long sentences. That guy, as a result of our work together, is no longer in prison. And I found out that all the time I spent on that one individual was fine for him, but it did nothing for hundreds of thousands of other people who to this day are still locked up. So my focus is now expanding to more of the systemic issues that underlie our system. And we need to create ways to educate the public about those costs that we were talking about, the personal cost, the family cost, the financial cost, the harm that's done. There has to be much more emphasis on prevention. All those things are covered in some of the things that I put on my website. And fortunately, every year there's an increasing number of people that are interested in transformation of the so-called justice system. And that, to me, gives me hope that the potential for change is greater now than it has ever been.
Well, we will work hard to help you do that. So don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And we thank you for the time you spent today, long time too, that you granted us to talk about this. But I think it's extremely important because I agree with you. People need to know these facts, and telling the stories, I think, can help make a difference. So I'm glad you expanded your horizon, and we're there to do everything we can to help you reach everybody that's possible to reach so that we can begin to make this very, very necessary change.
Thank you, Wolf, for being here. And I'm sure you will be returning at different points in the future to speak with us. And we admire and respect everything that you do.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. I know for sure that only teamwork is going to make this happen.
All right. Well, yay for our team. Bye-bye. Thank you.
This podcast comes from Unincarcerated Productions and Grindle Industries. Every episode of Justice Delayed is produced and edited by Cameron Collins and Milo Bershane. Music on this episode is from Speculation. Learn more and check out Spec at speculation.bandcamp.com. That's spekulation.bandcamp.com. And of course, head on over to unincarcerated.com to find out more about Unincarcerated Productions. We will see you all next time.